Most of the cabins were made of double cabins or double buildings where you had a single chimney that would take the heat from both sides, and it would go up from a chimney in one side of the duplex, so to speak, and another on the other side, and then just above that by roughly 10 feet up, then it would join, and the heat then was going out of a single chimney at the very top. Typically, the ideal cabin for heating purposes was 16 by 16, and yet we're talking about that being for 4, 5, 6, 7 or more people. So that begins to give you a little bit more idea of what the whole tone of their life was like, because they were not where they could just have lots of open space and be away from everybody else.
The primary markers are, besides the fact that they were built mid-19th century or before 1860, is the one room, no kitchen. Obviously people lived here with other support systems in place.
One of the differences that applied to the slaves before emancipation was that they tended on the whole to be tied to a single plantation and stay there the bulk of their life.
Usually in rural South Carolina, you look for the plantation house and then hope the slave cabins are behind it or somewhere around. This inside an urban environment like Anderson is a new landscape for us to explore.
There are other structures like this that have evolved, and we want to know about those, and we want to tell the story of those places. Again, getting back to the built environment of African Americans, what better place to start than slave cabins?
The wonderful thing about these places, though, is the fact that they communicate their history in ways that you don't know it right off. The history unfolds as you live with them and as other documentation pops up. And there's still a lot of mystery with these buildings. Those buildings are like repositories of knowledge that if you just pause and sit there for a while, you can start listening to it. And you start being inspired by it. And that's why it's so important.
It's important to know what was and what was wrong about it and how people fared living into a slave cabin. We want to look at the great mansions and know what they were about. Why shouldn't we want to know about what everyday life was like for much more common people?
There are a lot of plantation houses that we can visit, but a lot of those plantation houses that we visit tend to concentrate on just that, those plantation houses, and not a whole lot on the slave cabins.
In conversations with folks from the African American community, there tends to be a painful memories that many people believe they would rather not deal with. The most recent, of course, is the system of segregation we had in the state. And some of these buildings reminds them of that painful aspect and becomes a symbol of that.
During the time of segregation, there were buildings out there that, although they were nice, big, and iconic, they've got a history too. Were they always welcoming to African Americans? Or were we relegated to some obscure place within that building? And we got to think about those buildings that were built specifically to accommodate us. Those hotels, when we traveled, we had to plan our trips accordingly. We had to go to those places that would be welcoming to African Americans. So I think by starting here with slave cabins and getting more people interested in the story of slave cabins, then we can branch out from there and tell the story of all those other buildings out there that can help us tell the story of African Americans.
I personally believe that our history, the good, the bad, it's all part of the history, and it's all organically connected. You wouldn't have had the good without the bad. It was all part of it, and it must be remembered. As fun as old buildings are, and old buildings are to look at, it's about the people that touched them. It's about finding out our history through the people who lived there, who helped build our community, who made the sacrifices, who lived the life during the times that our communities were being developed. Because in that time when our communities were being built, is that time and space where things worked properly, where the community grew, where commerce happened, and where the foundation of our towns and cities were developed.
There's been enormous amount of stigmatizing for those who had slaves compared to those who didn't, and that creates a whole different dynamic of how the general perception was, and whether the people who didn't have slaves were nicer people because they didn't have slaves, or it may have been just because they were poor, or all sorts of other types of things.
The experience that I've looked into and studied, the experience of the slaves that lived on plantations were as diverse as the plantation owners.
There was a very prosperous owner in the Low Country who did have about 400 slaves. He had gone out riding in his carriage one day with some people with him, and he saw this pretty flower across from where he was and asked what in the world that was, because it was so striking to him. It turned out to be his main crop, and he didn't even know what it was. By contrast, particularly in the upstate, owners were almost always themselves involved in the agricultural process. It was a much more intimate type of thing and a much more familiar type of thing.
Well, I think probably the perception of snapshots of history as we see it are somewhat misleading. They're factual, but it's somewhat misleading. You know, there are a lot of things throughout the course of slavery and during that period of time that so many people don't know, especially young people.
One of them is this example in my book of Patsy, who was a slave, and the owner so regarded her that he had a charcoal drawing made of her, and it was passed down through multiple generations. And there were other similar things with Lucinda, who was a slave, and we don't know the whole story about her, and there's apparently a very good backstory that we don't know, but her owner paid for the premier marble makers in Charleston to make a tombstone for her and ship it to Pendleton. It would obviously have to have been something fairly dramatic for it to have been so much that they would buy this tombstone.
Some were taken care of very well, and some weren't.
The very concept about trying to describe slavery in some ways hardly works, because there are so many different variations about every different type of thing, from one plantation to the next. One of the things that is fairly obvious, at least just in a personal context, but we don't get the specifics, is that somebody living on plantation A may have been very nice and decent within the circumstances with their slaves, and had been equally well aware that the slave owner next door would be beating the slave. And so you could get something just within a mile variation on something like that.
There are things that we are proud of and that we're not proud of in regards to our history. But if we don't learn from the bad things that happen in our history, we'll never be able to go forward. And so understanding the bad things and the tragic things, the Jim Crow laws and slavery, understanding why those happened and the sacrifices that people made to bring things like that to an end, both white and black, gives us a better understanding of going forward.
I think for most of us, people want to know something about where they came from and are wanting to know more about where they fit into this much, much larger picture. And to do that, they have to know some about history in general and more specifically their own family history.
I mean, if we can just get people to really understand their lineage and how their family history connects to the bigger picture. And so if we can get people to understand their family history, and that kind of dovetails into African American history, and we all have history.
I know that by concentrating here in the state of South Carolina and sleeping in as many cabins as I can, I would have touched everybody's ancestry eventually. And it's important for those that are wanting to know more about their roots, more about their genealogy. This might give them that incentive to do that research that can actually physically tie their history to a particular plantation.
People are trying to retreat back to the past to be able to fill out more of their own lives and even what their circumstances are today and how they came about.
It's important for African Americans to learn about these structures because it's our history, it's our culture. A history that had a happy ending. These folks that inhabited these spaces endured quite a bit, but you know they survived. And they were able to move on beyond that.
Our history, the good, the bad, it's all part of the history and it's all organically connected. You wouldn't have had the good without the bad. It was all part of it, and it must be remembered. One, to keep it from being repeated again, to remember how prejudices and fear created certain systems that, though I don't believe they would come back necessarily, but that fear can create other negative systems in the future. And so I think one of the biggest lessons is how tragic the outcome of fear has been in the history of South Carolina. Fear of slave insurrections, fear of if Lincoln was elected, fear of any number of things that people would feel like they would upset the world in which they had built around themselves, and then the actions they took to make themselves feel more comfortable. That has to be told, and we have to save these places so that that conversation can take place on the site, on the place, at this building where the waves of the past 200 years of humanity have swept past it, and where you could try to tap into that a little bit. And that's what we're trying to do, to allow that conversation to happen. People can discuss it if they want, they can ignore it if they want, but that place will always, as far as we're concerned, will always have the opportunity to tell the story to anybody who's willing to listen.